Hello, I'm Aneka from Made to Sew and welcome to my Sewing for Beginners series. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to use a sewing machine. Now, I'm going to presume that you do know how to thread your sewing machine. If you don't, then please follow the link here to my playlist where I have a tutorial on how to thread the top part of the sewing machine, load the bobbin, and also collect the bobbin threads. Once you've done that, you can join me back here and I'm going to be showing you how to use the machine. The basic things that you need to know in order to get started. So let's begin. Now, the sewing machine that I've got here has been threaded. The top thread has gone in and I've threaded the needle. I have also loaded the bobbin. This is a front loading bobbin, but you may have a top loading bobbin. And both threads are underneath the presser foot to the side or back of the sewing machine. If you are unsure on any of those parts when it comes to threading, please take a look at the playlist. I'll pop a link here and watch the video that you need to help you. It might be obvious, but you need to begin by plugging your sewing machine in. Just like so. Now you might have one plug for the mains and one plug for your presser foot, like I have with my machine. You may have a machine that has a plug that will include both the presser foot and the mains. Once you've switched on your machine at the mains, you can then switch your machine on at the side. By switching your machine on, the light will come on and you may have a little bit of a noise as it wakes up. Now the machine is switched on, we can begin to look at what it will do. You should have a selection of stitches available on your sewing machine. This might only be a couple, it might only be one, or it might be a giant number. It really doesn't matter when you're first starting. We're going to be looking at the basic stitches that you need to know. You should have somewhere a button or a dial that will allow you to increase your stitch length. You should also have a button or a dial that would allow you to increase your stitch width. On some machines, the stitch width is also with the stitches and it pre-programs the stitch width for you. So your machine might be slightly different. It depends on the make and model that you have. You may, if you're lucky, have the ability to move the needle to the left and the right without your machine creating a zigzag stitch or changing the stitch. You may have a speed control dial like I've got here, faster and slower. You may have a needle up and down button. This will position the needle down into the fabric or back up. You should somewhere have a reverse button for stitching. It might be here and it might be a lever you need to push down, or it might be a little button up in this area. And this machine also has a start-stop button if I want to use it without the foot pedal. Generally speaking, I will always recommend that you use a sewing machine with a foot pedal if you're able to, because I do believe that it gives better control. But that's my personal opinion. To amend the tension on this sewing machine, there is a dial at the top here, rather than on the side area. If you want to learn a little bit more about tension, what it is, and when you need to change it, please follow the link to my corresponding tutorial here. So I recommend that you just take a little look. If you've got a manual for your machine, have a browse through the manual, or perhaps go and download one on the internet if you don't have one, just to familiarize yourself with what your machine is offering you. Let's take a look at a couple of different machines and how they're laid out. This machine is slightly different. Here are the variety of stitches that you can choose from. You need to use this dial to choose your stitch. This dial up here deals with the stitch width, how wide the stitch is, but it also can move the needle towards the left if you are doing a straight stitch and there is no width function. This dial deals with the length of the stitch. Finally, you have the tension and the reverse button. This machine is slightly different again. Here are the variety of stitches you can choose from. You would choose your stitch using this dial. Unfortunately, you do not have a width function on this machine. If you want to use a stitch that has a variety of widths, such as stitch C, a zigzag stitch, you have to use the selector and you would just use the lines on stitch C. Closer to stitch B is a smaller width, closer to stitch C is a larger width of the zigzag. You do have the ability to amend the stitch length using this dial. And finally, here is the back stitch or reverse stitch and your tension. When you're first using a sewing machine, I would always recommend that you do a straight stitch. This is a stitch that you're probably going to be using most of the time. On my machine, it is number 1 and it looks just like a dotted line. If I click number 1, nothing changes because that's what the machine is set to as standard, and it will probably be the case for your machine as well. You may find that you have 2 options. Sometimes you'll get an option with a straight stitch with the needle in the middle, or the needle on the left or the right, and you'll just see that the stitch will move over slightly. Either of those is fine to start with. In terms of your stitch length, I've got a little dial up here that shows me what my length is, and I'd like this to be on about 2.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters, something like that, because again, that's very standard. Now you shouldn't have to worry about your width function for your straight stitch because there is no width. The needle will simply move forwards. It does not move from side to side or left to right. And with my machine, I do have the ability to move the needle, but I want the needle to be in the middle of my foot, which it is as standard. Some machines, again, put the needles to one side, sometimes the left as standard. And again, it doesn't really matter when you're first starting. I just want you to feel comfortable with the machine. So choose your settings, if you need to, for a straight stitch. Then grab some fabric, and I'm going to show you what you need to do to use the sewing machine. Now my sewing machine does have a table, so I will add that prior to using it. It just gives me a better flat surface to be able to sew on. Your machine may have a table, or it may have a little piece that slots on with an accessories case inside. Make sure that that piece is on when you're doing your standard sewing. It's easier to have a little bit of a run-up area here. Now you're going to want to pick a fabric that you don't mind testing on. Choose a cotton, a linen, a fabric that is stable and of medium weight so that it's easy for you when you're first learning. You are going to position the fabric underneath the presser foot, and for the first go, I wouldn't worry about how much fabric you put anywhere. Simply pop the fabric under, just like I'm doing here, and lower the presser foot. This will probably be a lever on the back of the machine. It will be under here somewhere. Whenever you begin sewing, you're going to want to position the needle into the fabric. And you're going to want to do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it helps to prevent you from losing the thread from the needle, which you will find quite frustrating. It also helps to check that everything is working and that you've chosen perhaps the right needle for the job. You're going to want to hold onto both threads, the needle thread and the bobbin thread. You can either hold them flat like I'm doing here with my left hand, or you can pinch them like this and hold them. You're going to want to use the hand wheel on the right hand side of the sewing machine to turn the needle towards you. It's very important that you turn it towards you so that the needle goes into the fabric. Once the needle's in the fabric, you're going to want to push your foot on the foot pedal very gently at the front. And there we go, we've started to sew. Obviously, the firmer you push your foot into the foot pedal, the quicker you will go. However, you may find on your sewing machine that you have a speed control so that you can control this or prevent yourself from going any quicker. It can be a little bit tricky to master that foot control, and it does depend on your foot pedal and the shape of it and sort of how good quality it is. But I promise it will come with practice. I recommend doing a couple of rows like this just to feel confident with how you're handling the machine. Whenever you're feeding the fabric in, you should always be doing that. I'm guiding the fabric. I am not pushing it in and I am not pulling it from the other side. I'm simply guiding it through the machine, and the feed dogs on the sewing machine will do their job. When you feel like stopping sewing, you will simply stop pushing down on the foot pedal. The machine should stop quite quickly. You may find that your needle finishes up or in the fabric. If your needle has finished in the fabric, you will use the hand wheel So if mine is finished in the fabric like so, I will use the hand wheel and again turn it towards me to raise the needle. I will then lift the presser foot using the same lever and I will slide the fabric away. Now, sometimes you can find that it can get a little bit tight, depending on whether the machine has completed the final stitch. If you feel that it's tight as you're pulling the fabric away, use your right hand on the hand wheel and just turn it towards you a little bit more and you should find that that will release things. And then use the thread cutter. This machine works from front to back and also from back to front. Some machines you will find will only work in one direction. Or you could use a pair of scissors to trim your threads. Now you feel comfortable using the sewing machine, I'm going to give you a few tips. The first one is when you start sewing, you want to have a minimum of about 1/2 centimetre, 1/4 of an inch behind the needle. So when I put my foot down now, I want to make sure there's a little bit of fabric behind the needle. And what that does is it helps to pull the fabric through the machine. There are times when you do have to sew right from the edge of the fabric, but the rest of the time you're always better to give the machine a little bit of fabric to grip because it needs something to help pull it through. These are the feed dogs on the sewing machine here, and you will see as I turn the hand wheel and the needle goes down and the needle then comes back up that the feed dogs move. They are what help to pull your fabric through the machine. Position the foot down with that 1/4 of an inch or 5 millimeters of fabric behind the needle. As I showed you before, turn the hand wheel towards you, hold the threads, position the needle in. Now, when you're sewing, most of the time you're going to want to be sewing in a specific location. That means you're going to need to have a guide of some sort. And you will see on the metal plates here that I have lots of markings for different measurements. Most of the time, I'm going to be guiding my edge of fabric in line with one of those. So you're going to want to make sure that you watch your edges here rather than watch the needle. Most of the time, you're going to begin by fixing your stitches so that it doesn't come undone. You will sew about 2 or 3 stitches forwards, and then I'm going to press the backwards button to sew 2 or 3 stitches backwards. This will fix everything in place and stop my stitches from coming undone. I would then sew the seam. As I'm sewing, I am not watching the needle, I'm watching where my fabric is on the metal plate, on the lines on the metal plate. To stop sewing, I'm also going to want to secure my stitching. So again, I'm going to want to do about 2 or 3 stitches backwards, and then again 2 or 3 stitches forwards. Your backwards button may be here, it may be on the side of the machine here. And what that will do is it will fix your stitches. I generally prefer a back stitch when I'm really wanting to secure stitches. Your machine may also have a fixing stitch, which is a stitch that stitches 4 or 5 times on top of itself. This is great if you're quilting, if I'm making a sample garment or something, or if you're just wanting something to sort of fix it, but it doesn't have to be that strong. Then I use the fixing or lock stitch. Otherwise, a back stitch is the way to go. If your machine is rather old, it doesn't have a back stitch, then probably the best bet is that you sew over yourself or you tie your threads after you've pulled it out. Once you've finished, you're going to lift the presser foot, slide the fabric away and cut it off, just like so. You can sew all the way to the edge of the fabric if you want to, and you will find that it's easier to sew right to the edge of the fabric than it is to start right on the edge of the fabric. However, most of the time you'll be finishing a similar distance, about 1/4 of an inch, 5 to 6 millimeters away from the edge. It will just help when you're doing that back stitch for the machine to feed the fabric through. You want to keep your back stitch to a minimum, which is why I recommend 2 to 3 stitches so that it doesn't look ugly, because it can be on visible areas. If you're worried about it being visible, then please feel free to tie your threads off, and I'll pop a link to my video on how to do that here. Now that you feel comfortable just playing with the machine and sort of using it basically, please join me in my next video where I will show you how to sew a straight stitch. And we'll be discussing different uses and methods for using this straight stitch that we've done here. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you now feel more confident when it comes to working with a sewing machine. Join me in the next tutorial where I share with you 3 different types of straight stitches and when you might want to use them.